Good evening, and welcome to Footnotes Folly. I am Professor Reginald St. John Pemberton, and tonight we open the second book of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, the book the ancients called Euterpe, though you and I may call it simply the Book of Egypt. We carry on in plain modern English, from the first line, with nothing left out, still using Macaulay's public domain translation. The plain rendering, and the muttering, are my own. This is part 7. Cyrus is dead, his son Cambyses now holds the Persian throne, and means to march on Egypt. But before a single spear is lifted, Herodotus halts the whole war for an entire book, because he simply cannot help himself. He has been to Egypt, the oldest and strangest land he ever saw, and he is going to tell us everything. We begin with a king who tried to discover the oldest people on earth by experiment, and with a great river that makes Egypt possible at all. Let us begin.
When Cyrus ended his life, Cambyses inherited the royal power. He was the son of Cyrus and Cassandane, the daughter of Pharnaces. Cassandane had died before Cyrus, and Cyrus had mourned deeply for her himself and had also ordered all the people under his rule to mourn for her. Cambyses then, being the son of this woman and of Cyrus, regarded the Ionians and Aeolians as slaves passed down to him from his father. He set out to lead an army against Egypt, taking with him as allies not only the other nations he ruled, but also those Hellenes who were under his power. Before Psammetichus became king over them, the Egyptians used to believe that they were the first of all peoples to come into existence. But after Psammetichus became king and wanted to know which people had first come into being, they came to believe that the Phrygians were older than themselves, while they themselves were older than all other people. Psammetichus could not discover by inquiry any sure way to learn who had first come into existence, so he devised the following experiment. He took 2 newborn children of ordinary parents and gave them to a shepherd to raise among his flocks, under the conditions I shall describe. He ordered that no one should speak any word in their presence, that they should be kept by themselves in a room where no one was allowed to enter, and that at the proper times the shepherd should bring she-goats to them, feed them with milk until they were satisfied, and do whatever else was needed for them. Psammetichus arranged this, and gave these orders because he wanted to hear what word the children would first utter after they had passed beyond meaningless crying. And this is what happened. For 2 years the shepherd continued to do as he had been commanded. Then at last, when he opened the door and went in, both children fell before him as suppliants, stretched out their hands, and said the word because. At first, when the shepherd heard this, he kept silent. But as he visited them continually and cared for them, the word was repeated many times. At last he reported the matter to his master, and at the king's command, brought the children before him. Psammetichus heard the word himself, and began to ask what nation used the word because for anything. By inquiry he found that the Phrygians used that word for bread. In this way, and on the strength of such evidence, the Egyptians were led to admit that the Phrygians were a more ancient people than themselves. I heard from the priests of Hephaestus at Memphis that this was how it happened. The Hellenes, however, tell many other foolish stories about it, including one in which Psammetichus cut out the tongues of certain women, and then made the children live with them. About the rearing of the children, the priests told the story as I have given it. I also heard other things at Memphis when I spoke with the priests of Hephaestus. I went to Thebes and Heliopolis for the same purpose, because I wished to know whether the priests in those places would agree with the accounts given by the priests at Memphis. The men of Heliopolis are said to be the most learned of the Egyptians in records. As for the stories I heard concerning the gods, I am not eager to relate them fully. I shall only name them, because I believe that all people are equally ignorant about such matters. Whatever I record about them, I shall record only because the course of my story compels me to do so. But regarding matters that concern human beings, the priests agreed with one another. They said that the Egyptians were the first people on earth to discover the course of the year, dividing the seasons into 12 parts to make up the whole. They said they learned this from the stars. In this respect, it seems to me, they reckon more wisely than the Hellenes. The Hellenes insert an extra month every other year to make the seasons come right, whereas the Egyptians count 12 months of 30 days each and add 5 extra days every year beyond that number. In this way the cycle of their seasons is completed and returns to the same point from which it began. The priests also said that the Egyptians were the first to use names for the 12 gods, and that the Hellenes adopted this practice from them. They said that the Egyptians were the first to assign altars, images, and temples to the gods, and the first to engrave figures on stones. In most of these matters they showed me by actual evidence that what they said was true. They also said that the first man to become king of Egypt was Min. In his time, all Egypt except the district of Thebes was a swamp, and none of the regions that now lie below the lake of Moeris were then above water. From the sea it is a 7 days' voyage up the river to that lake. I thought they spoke well about the land, for the truth is plain even to someone who has not heard it beforehand but has only seen the country, provided he has understanding. The Egypt to which the Hellenes sail is land that the Egyptians have gained as an addition, and it is a gift of the river. The regions above this lake as well, for a distance of 3 days' sailing, are another example of the same thing, although the priests did not continue by saying so. The nature of the land of Egypt is as follows. First, while you are still approaching it by ship and are a day's run from land, if you let down a sounding line you will bring up mud and find yourself in 11 fathoms of water. This shows that the land is silting forward into the sea. Second, as for Egypt itself, its extent along the sea is 60 scoins, if we define Egypt as reaching from the Gulf of Plinthine to the Serbonian lake, beside which Mount Casion stretches. From that lake the 60 scoins are reckoned. People who have little land measure their country by fathoms. Those who are less poor in land measure by furlongs. Those who have much land measure by parasangs, and those who have a very great abundance of land measure by scoins. A parasang equals 30 furlongs, and each scoin, an Egyptian measure, equals 60 furlongs. Thus the coastland of Egypt would extend 3,600 furlongs. From their inland as far as Heliopolis, Egypt is broad. The land is entirely flat, without springs of water, and made of mud. The road inland from the sea to Heliopolis is about the same length as the road from the altar of the 12 gods at Athens to Pisa, and the temple of Olympian Zeus. If you calculate it, you will find that the difference between the two roads is very small, not more than 15 furlongs. The road from Athens to Pisa falls 15 furlongs short of 1,500, while the road from the sea to Heliopolis reaches that number exactly. From Heliopolis upward, however, Egypt is narrow. On one side a mountain range belonging to Arabia runs beside it, stretching from the north toward midday in the south wind, and rising without a break toward what is called the Erythraean Sea. In this range are the stone quarries from which stone was cut for the pyramids at Memphis. On that side the mountain ends where I have said, and then turns back. Where it is widest, as I was told, it takes 2 months to cross from east to west, and its eastern borders are said to produce frankincense. Such is the character of this mountain range. On the side of Egypt toward Libya another range extends, rocky and covered with sand. In this range are the pyramids, and it runs in the same direction as the parts of the Arabian mountains that go toward midday. So from Heliopolis onward, the land has no longer any great extent so far as it belongs to Egypt. For about 4 days sailing up the river, Egypt properly so called is narrow. The space between the mountain ranges I have mentioned is plain land, but where it is narrowest it did not seem to me to be more than 200 furlongs from the Arabian mountains to those called the Libyan mountains. After this, Egypt becomes broad again. Such is the nature of this land. From Heliopolis to Thebes is a 9 days' voyage up the river, and the distance of the journey is 4,860 furlongs or 81 scoins. If these measures of Egypt are added together in furlongs, the result is this. I have already shown that the distance along the sea is 3,600 furlongs. I will now state the distance inland from the sea to Thebes. It is 6,120 furlongs. Again, the distance from Thebes to the city called Elephantine is 1,800 furlongs. Of this land I have been speaking about, it seemed to me also, as the priests said, that the greater part had been gained by the Egyptians as an addition. It was clear to me that the space between the mountain ranges above the city of Memphis was once a gulf of the sea, like the regions around Ilion, Teuthrania, Ephesos, and the plain of the Meander, if it is permitted to compare small things with great. These are small by comparison, for none of the rivers that heaped up soil in those regions is worthy to be compared in volume with even one of the mouths of the Nile, which has 5 mouths. There are also other rivers, not at all equal to the Nile in size, that have done great works. I can name several, especially the Aclus, which flows through Acarnania and then issues into the sea, and has already turned half of the Echenades from islands into mainland. Now in the land of Arabia, not far from Egypt, there is a gulf of the sea running in from what is called the Erythraean Sea. It is very long and narrow, as I am about to explain. As for the length of the voyage along it, a man setting out from the innermost point to sail out through it into the open sea would spend 40 days on the voyage if he used oars. As for its breadth, where the gulf is widest, it is half a day's sail across. In it there is an ebb and flow of the tide every day. I suppose that Egypt was once just such another gulf. One gulf ran inland toward Ethiopia from the northern sea, while the other, the Arabian Gulf of which I am speaking, stretched from the south toward Syria. The two gulfs bored inward, so that their extreme ends almost met, passing by one another with only a small space left between them. If the stream of the Nile were to turn aside into this Arabian Gulf, what would prevent that gulf from being filled with silt as the river continued to flow, at least within 20,000 years? For my part, I think it would be filled even within 10,000 years. How then, in all the time that passed before I was born, could a gulf even much larger than this fail to be filled by a river so great and so active? As for Egypt, then, I both believe those who say this is so, and I myself am strongly convinced of it. I have observed that Egypt projects farther into the sea than the neighboring land, that shells are found on its mountains, that a salt deposit forms on the surface, so that even the pyramids are being eaten away by it, and that, of all the mountains in Egypt, only the range above Memphis has sand. Besides this, I notice that Egypt resembles neither the land of Arabia, which borders it, nor Libya, nor Syria, for Syrians live in the parts of Arabia along the sea. Instead, Egypt has soil that is black and easily crumbled, because it is in truth mud and silt brought down from Ethiopia by the river. The soil of Libya, as we know, is reddish and rather sandy, while that of Arabia and Syria is somewhat clay and rocky. The priests also gave me strong proof about this land. They said that in the reign of King Maurus, whenever the river rose to a height of at least 8 cubits, it watered Egypt below Memphis. Yet not even 900 years had passed since the death of Maurus, when I heard these things from the priests. Now, however, unless the river rises to 16 cubits, or at least 15, it does not overflow the land. I think that the Egyptians who live below the lake of Maurus, especially in the region called the Delta, will suffer for all future time from the Nile, no longer flooding their land, if that land continues to rise in height and increase in extent at the same rate. They will suffer the very thing which they themselves said the Hellenes would one day suffer. When they heard that the whole land of the Hellenes has rain and is not watered by rivers as Egypt is, they said that the Hellenes would one day be disappointed in a great hope, and would endure the evils of famine. What this saying means is that if the god does not send them rain, but allows drought to last for a long time, the Hellenes will be destroyed by hunger, because in fact they have no other supply of water to save them except from Zeus alone. This was rightly said by the Egyptians about the Hellenes. But now let me explain how matters stand for the Egyptians themselves in their turn. If, as I said before, their land below Memphis, which is the part that is increasing, continues to rise in height at the same rate as in the past, then surely the Egyptians who live there will suffer famine, unless their land has rain or the river is able to overflow their fields. Yet it is certain that, at present, they gather the fruits of the earth with less labor than any other people, and with less labor even than the other Egyptians. They do not have to break furrows with a plow, or hoe, or do any of the other work that other people do for a crop. Instead, when the river has risen by itself, watered their fields, and then withdrawn again, each man sows his own field and turns swine into it. When he has used the swine to tread the seed into the ground, he waits for the harvest. Then, after threshing the grain by means of the swine, he gathers it in. If we choose to follow the opinion of the Ionians about Egypt, they say that the delta alone is Egypt. They reckon its seacoast from the watchtower called the Watchtower of Perseus to the fish-curing houses of Pelusium, a distance of 40 skoins, and they count it as extending inland as far as the city of Kirkosoros, where the Nile divides and runs toward Pelusium and Canobos. As for the rest of Egypt, they assign part of it to Libya and part to Arabia. If we followed this account, we would be declaring that in former times the Egyptians had no land to live in. For as we have seen, their delta at least is alluvial, and so to speak, has appeared only recently, as the Egyptians themselves say, and as I myself believe. If, then, there was at first no land for them to live in, why did they waste their labor trying to prove that they had come into existence before all other people? They would not have needed to test the children to see what language they would first speak. Still, I do not believe that the Egyptians came into being at the same time as the land which the Ionians call the Delta. Rather, I believe they have existed ever since the human race came into being, and that as their land advanced outward, many of them remained in their first homes while many gradually came down to the lower regions. At any rate, it is certain that in ancient times Thebes bore the name of Egypt, and the circumference of this region measures 6,120 furlongs. If we judge these matters correctly, the Ionian opinion about Egypt is not sound. But if the judgment of the Ionians is right, then I declare that neither the Hellenes nor the Ionians themselves know how to reckon when they say that the whole earth is made up of 3 divisions, Europe, Asia, and Libya. For they ought to count the delta of Egypt as a 4th division, since, on their own account, it belongs neither to Asia nor to Libya. By that reckoning, the Nile cannot be the river that divides Asia from Libya, because the Nile splits at the point of this delta so as to flow around it, with the result that this land would lay between Asia and Libya. We therefore set aside the opinion of the Ionians, and give our own judgment on the matter. Egypt is all the land inhabited by Egyptians, just as Cilicia is the land inhabited by Cilicians, and Assyria the land inhabited by Assyrians. Properly speaking, we know of no boundary between Asia and Libya except the borders of Egypt. If, however, we adopt the opinion commonly held by the Hellenes, we shall suppose that the whole of Egypt, beginning from the cataract and the city of Elephantine, is divided into 2 parts and shares both names, one side belonging to Libya and the other to Asia. For from the cataract onward the Nile flows to the sea, cutting Egypt through the middle. As far as the city of Kirkosoros the Nile flows in a single stream, but from that city onward it divides into 3 channels. One, called the Pelusian mouth, turns toward the east. The second channel goes toward the west, and is called the Canopic mouth. The channel that runs straight continues in this way. As the river flows downward and comes to the point of the delta, it cuts through the middle of the delta, and so issues into the sea. This channel contains a portion of the river's water that is neither the smallest nor the least famous, and it is called the Sebennytic mouth. There are also 2 other mouths that branch off from the Sebennytic and run to the sea. One is called the Saitic mouth, and the other the Mendesian mouth. The Bulbitinitic and Bucolic mouths, on the other hand, are not natural, but were made by digging. The answer given by the oracle of Ammon also supports my opinion that Egypt has the extent I assigned to it in my account, though I heard of this answer only after I had already formed my own view about Egypt. People of the cities of Maria and Apis live in the parts of Egypt bordering Libya. They believed that they were Libyans and not Egyptians, and they were burdened by the rules of religious service because they did not wish to be barred from eating the flesh of cows. So they sent to Ammon, saying that they had nothing in common with the Egyptians, since they lived outside the delta and agreed with them in nothing. They said they wished it to be lawful for them to eat everything without distinction. But the god did not permit them to do this. He said that Egypt was the land which the Nile came over and watered, and that Egyptians were those who lived below the city of Elephantine and drank from that river. This was the answer given to them by the oracle about the matter. And when the Nile is in flood, it covers not only the delta, but also parts of the land called Libyan and parts of the land called Arabian, sometimes as much as 2 days' journey on each side, sometimes even more, and sometimes less. As for the nature of the river, I could learn nothing from the priests or from anyone else. I especially wanted to learn from them why the Nile begins to come down in greater volume from the summer solstice onward for 100 days, and then, after reaching that number of days, turns back and decreases in its stream, so that through the whole winter season it remains low until the summer solstice returns. I could get no account of any of these things from the Egyptians, though I asked them what power the Nile has that makes its nature opposite to that of other rivers. I made inquiry because I wanted to know both what I have just said and also why, unlike all other rivers, it does not give rise to breezes blowing from it. Some of the Hellenes, however, wishing to win a reputation for cleverness, have given 3 different explanations of this water. 2 of them I do not think worth discussing, except just to indicate their character. One explanation says that the Etesian winds cause the river to rise by preventing the Nile from flowing out into the sea. But often the Etesian winds fail, and yet the Nile does the same work it usually does. Moreover, if these winds were the cause, then all other rivers that flow in a direction opposite to the Etesian winds ought to be affected in the same way as the Nile, and even more so, since they are smaller and present a weaker current against them. There are many such rivers in Syria and many also in Libya, and they are not affected in anything like the same way as the Nile. The second explanation shows even more ignorance than the first, and it is more marvelous to tell. It says that the river produces these effects because it flows from the ocean, and that the ocean flows around the whole earth. The third explanation is much the most plausible, but nevertheless it is the most mistaken of all. It has no more truth in it than the others, because it claims that the Nile flows from melting snow, whereas the river flows out of Libya, through the midst of the Ethiopians, and then comes into Egypt. How could it flow from snow, when it flows from the hottest regions toward cooler ones? Most of the facts are such as to convince a person capable of reasoning about these matters that it is not at all likely to flow from snow. The first and greatest evidence is supplied by the winds, which blow hot from those regions. The second is that the land is always without rain, and without frost, whereas after snow has fallen, rain must necessarily come within 5 days. Therefore, if snow fell in those regions, rain would fall there too. The third evidence comes from the people who live there, who are black in color because of the burning heat. Moreover, kites and swallows remain there all year and do not leave the land, while cranes, fleeing the cold weather that comes in the region of Scythia, regularly come to these parts for the winter. If even a little snow fell in the land through which the Nile flows, and where it has its sources, none of these things would happen, as necessity compels us to admit. As for the man who spoke about the ocean, he carried his tale into the realm of the unknown, and so he needs no refutation. I myself know of no river-ocean in existence, but I think that Homer, or one of the poets before him, invented the name and introduced it into his verse. If, however, after finding fault with the opinions that have been proposed, I am bound to declare my own view about these doubtful matters, I will say what I think is the reason why the Nile rises in summer. In the winter season the sun, driven away from his former path through the heaven by stormy winds, comes to the upper parts of Libya. If one wished to state the matter as briefly as possible, everything has now been said. Whatever region this god approaches most closely and stands directly above may reasonably be supposed to be most lacking in water, and the native streams of its rivers are most dried up. To explain it at greater length, the matter is as follows. When the sun passes in his course through the upper parts of Libya, he acts in this way. Since the air in those regions is always clear and the country is warm, because there are no cold winds, the sun, as he passes through it, does just what he is accustomed to do in summer when he travels through the middle of the heaven. He draws water to himself. After drawing it up, he drives it away to the upper parts of the country, and the winds take it up, scatter it abroad, and dissolve it into rain. Therefore it is natural that the winds which blow from this region, the south and southwest winds, should be by far the rainiest of all winds. I do not think, however, that the sun sends away from himself all the water of the Nile each year, but that he also leaves some of it behind with himself. Then, when winter becomes milder, the sun returns again to the middle of the heaven, and from that time onward he draws equally from all rivers. In the meantime, those other rivers flow in great volume, because much rainwater mingles with them, since their country receives rain at that season, and is filled with torrent streams. In summer, however, they are weak, because the rain showers fail, and because they are drawn up by the sun. The Nile alone of all rivers has no rain, and is drawn by the sun. Therefore it naturally flows during winter in a volume much smaller than its proper amount, that is, much smaller than in summer. In summer it is drawn equally with all other waters, but in winter it bears the burden alone. Thus I suppose the sun to be the cause of these things. In my opinion, the sun is also the cause of the dryness of the air in these parts, because he makes it so by scorching his path through the heaven. In this way summer always prevails in the upper parts of Libya. But if the station of the seasons had been changed, and the place in the heaven where the north wind and winter are now set were instead the station of the south wind and midday, while the place where the south wind is now set were occupied by the north, then if this were so, the sun, driven from the middle of the heaven by winter and the north wind, would go to the upper parts of Europe just as he now comes to the upper parts of Libya. Passing in his course through the whole of Europe, I suppose he would do to the Easter what he now does to the Nile. As for the breeze, and why none blows from the river, my opinion is that it is not natural for anything to blow from very hot places, and that a breeze is accustomed to blow from something cold. Let these matters be as they are, and as they were from the beginning. But as for the sources of the Nile, no Egyptian, Libyan, or Hellene who came into conversation with me claimed to know anything about them, except the scribe of the sacred treasury of Athene in the city of Sais in Egypt. To me, however, this man did not seem to be speaking seriously when he said that he had certain knowledge of the matter. He said that there were two mountains whose peaks rose to a sharp point, situated between the city of Sin, which is in the district of Thebes, and Elephantine. The names of the mountains were Crophi and Mophi. From the middle between these two mountains, he said, flowed the sources of the Nile, fathomless in depth. Half the water flowed toward Egypt and the north wind, and the other half toward Ethiopia and the south wind. As proof that the source was fathomless, he said that Psammetichus, king of Egypt, had tested the matter. Psammetichus had a rope twisted many thousands of fathoms long and let it down at this place, but it found no bottom. If what the scribe told me was really as he said, he made me understand by it that there were strong eddies there and a backward current, and that because the water dashed against the mountains, the sounding line could not reach any bottom when it was let down. From no other person was I able to learn anything about this matter. But for the rest, I learned the following by the most careful inquiry, for I went myself as an eyewitness as far as the city of Elephantine, and from that point onward I gathered knowledge by report. As one goes up the river from Elephantine, there is country that slopes steeply. Here one must fasten ropes to both sides of the vessel, as one fastens an ox, and so make one's way onward. If the rope breaks, the vessel is immediately gone, carried off by the violence of the stream. Through this country the voyage is about 4 days long. In this part the Nile winds like the river meander, and the distance amounts to 12 scoins, which must be traversed in this way. Then one comes to a level plain, where the Nile flows around an island named Tecumseh. In the regions above Elephantine there dwell Ethiopians immediately next in order, and they occupy half of this island, while Egyptians occupy the other half. Adjoining this island is a great lake, around which Ethiopian nomad tribes live. When one has sailed through this lake, one comes again to the stream of the Nile, which flows into it. After this one must disembark and make a journey by land for 40 days, because sharp rocks stand out of the water in the Nile, and there are many reefs, so that a vessel cannot pass. After passing through this country in the 40 days I have mentioned, one embarks again in another vessel and sails for 12 days. After this one comes to a great city called Meroe. This city is said to be the mother city of all the other Ethiopians. Its inhabitants revere only two of the gods, Zeus and Dionysos, and these they honor greatly. They have an oracle of Zeus established there, and they make warlike marches whenever this god commands them by prophecies, and to whatever place he commands. Sailing from the city, one comes to the deserters after another period of time equal to that spent in going from Elephantine to the mother city of the Ethiopians. The name of these deserters is Ismach, and this word, translated into the tongue of the Hellenes, means those who stand on the left hand of the king. There were 240,000 Egyptians of the warrior class who revolted and went over to the Ethiopians for the following reason. In the reign of Psammetichus, garrisons were posted in 3 places, one toward the Ethiopians at the city of Elephantine, another toward the Arabians and Assyrians at Daphne of Pelusium, and another toward Libya at Meria. Even in my own time the garrisons of the Persians are arranged in the same way as these were in the reign of Psammetichus, for the Persians have outposts both at Elephantine and at Daphne. The Egyptians of whom I speak had served as outposts for 3 years, and no one relieved them from their guard duty. Accordingly they consulted together, formed a common plan, and all in a body revolted from Psammetichus and set out for Ethiopia. When Psammetichus heard this he pursued them. When he caught up with them, he pleaded with them at length and tried to persuade them not to desert the gods of their country, nor their children and wives. At this, it is said, one of them pointed to his privy member and said that wherever this was, there they would have both children and wives. When these men came to Ethiopia, they gave themselves over to the king of the Ethiopians. He rewarded them in this way. There were certain Ethiopians who had become hostile to him, and he ordered the Egyptians to drive them out and live in their land. Since these men settled in the land of the Ethiopians had become gentler in their manners, because they learned the customs of the Egyptians. Thus the Nile, apart from the part of its course that lies in Egypt, is known for a journey of 4 months by river and land. That is the number of months found by reckoning the time spent in going from Elephantine to these deserters. The river runs from the west, and the setting of the sun. But what comes after that no one can say clearly, for that land is desert because of the burning heat.
And there we will pause, with the Nile still keeping its secret flooding in high summer when every other river runs low, and rising out of a source no man Herodotus could find would name. He has given us 3 theories of his own, demolished 2 of them with relish, and is no nearer the truth, which never stops him being fascinating. Next time, in Part 8, the strangest catalogue in ancient literature are people who, he swears, do everything precisely the wrong way round, and who are the most God-fearing men on earth. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.